On a Thursday morning in late March of 1994, Noreen Aldcroft walked into a barn sale outside Mineral Point, Wisconsin, and bought a dead woman's loom room for $400. The family had listed it that way in the weekly shopper's guide. Weaving equipment, fiber studio contents, $400 takes all. No individual prices, no description of what specifically was in the room, just a number that most people flipped past on their way to the used appliance listings. Most people. Let me tell you about Mineral Point in March of 1994, because you need to understand the place before you can understand what Noreen was walking into. This was lead country, old country, the kind of southwestern Wisconsin that still remembered when Cornish miners had dug their way through the hills and built stone cottages so low to the ground they looked like they'd grown there. The farms were small and the hills were steep, and the women who'd settled those hills had brought something with them from the old country that had nothing to do with mining. They'd brought their looms. And for 200 years, in the county that people now drove through, mostly on their way somewhere else, that tradition had kept itself alive in back rooms and spare bedrooms and converted sheds, passing from mother to daughter and from neighbor to neighbor in a chain of instruction that had no school and no certificate and no record anyone had thought to keep. The woman whose loom room this had been was named Agnes Kellstrom. She was 84 years old when she died in January of that year, and she had woven in the same second-floor room of the farmhouse outside Mineral Point for 61 years. Her husband Einar had died in 1988. She had one daughter in Phoenix who was an accountant and had never learned to weave and saw no reason to start. The daughter had hired a local man named Ted Branscombe to run the estate. Ted Branscombe ran estate sales and farm auctions in 3 counties and was considered reliable and fair, and was good at his job in every way that didn't require him to understand what he was looking at. He'd spent 20 minutes in Agnes Kellstrom's loom room before writing $400 in his notebook. He'd seen a big loom, old, wooden, complicated in the way of things that nobody made anymore. He'd seen boxes of fiber that smelled like lanolin and age. He'd seen tools he didn't have names for. He'd seen baskets and bobbins and spools and a wall of shelves covered in notebooks and folders that he'd taken for personal papers. He'd priced the whole room at $400 because that's what felt right for a lot of old equipment that a crafting person might want, and because he figured the loom would be the hard sell and the rest would go as a bonus. That is not what happened. Let me tell you about Noreen Aldcroft, because you need to understand the woman before you can understand what she did when she stepped into that room. Noreen was 51 years old in 1994. She had grown up in Dodgeville, the daughter of a weaver named Paulette Aldcroft, who had learned from her own mother and who had spent every Saturday of Noreen's childhood teaching her to read fiber the way other mothers taught their daughters to read music. Paulette had a way of talking about yarn that was more like talking about memory. She said that every fiber had a history in it. She said that when you spun wool, you were working with the specific character of a specific animal from a specific place, and that if you paid attention, you could feel all of that in your hands. She said that a textile was not a product. It was a record. It was the physical evidence of every decision a maker had made, preserved in the structure of the cloth itself, and that if you knew how to look at cloth, you knew something about the person who made it that you couldn't learn any other way. Noreen had grown up believing this the way other people grew up believing in the importance of a firm handshake or the value of a good winter coat. It was not a position she'd argued her way into. It was something she'd absorbed through her hands from the time she was 4 years old. By 1994, Noreen had been weaving professionally for 22 years. Not selling at craft fairs, not teaching beginner classes at the community center, though she'd done both when she had to. What she actually did was restoration and identification work for textile museums and private collectors throughout the upper Midwest, examining historical fabrics, identifying their origin, their period, their maker's tradition, and in some cases their maker, because in the old county traditions, a weaver's hand was as identifiable as a signature to someone who'd spent enough time looking. She was not well known outside of a small circle of curators and collectors. She drove a 1987 Subaru with a cracked dashboard and wore the same canvas jacket to every estate sale from April through November, and kept her reference library in 2 plastic bins in the back seat because she'd learned years ago that she needed it with her, not at home. She had a husband in Dodgeville who taught high school chemistry and took care of their dog when she went out to look at things. She had one graduate student who drove up from Madison once a month to sit with her and look at samples. She had, by 1994, handled more historical American textiles than almost anyone in the country who was not working inside a major institution. Ted Branscombe had no idea. Let me tell you about what Ted Branscombe knew, because it matters. Ted was 55 in 1994 and had been running estate sales in Grant and Iowa and Lafayette counties for 19 years. He knew furniture. He knew farm equipment with confidence. He knew glassware and kitchen items and tools within the normal range of what appeared at farm sales. He was honest, and he worked hard, and he priced things fairly based on what he knew, which was the extent of his obligation, and in most categories was sufficient. He had looked at Agnes Kellstrom's loom room and seen a category he did not know. Old weaving equipment, he had no reference point for what any of it was worth individually. He knew the loom was large and wooden and probably heavy and probably hard to move and probably of interest to someone who wove things. He had priced it accordingly. $400, everything in the room. Come and get it. Noreen had seen the listing in the shopper's guide on a Sunday evening and had sat very still for a moment before she reached for the phone. She called her graduate student, a young woman named Carrie, who drove the Subaru with her on the more significant trips and read the listing to her over the phone. Carrie said, "Kellstrom. Agnes Kellstrom?" "Noreen." Carrie said, "You're going." Noreen said, "Thursday." Carrie said, "I'm coming." Noreen said, "Yes." She arrived at the Kellstrom farm an hour before the sale opened and sat in the car at the end of the lane. One truck came and parked by the machinery shed. One minivan came and parked near the house. Neither driver looked at the farmhouse's upper windows. Noreen had looked at the upper windows the moment she turned onto the lane, because that was where the loom room was. And she had seen the size of the loom frame, silhouetted against the glass from 200 yards away, and had understood several things at once. When Ted Branscombe unlocked the side door at 9 o'clock, Noreen was the first person inside and the first person up the stairs. She stood in the doorway of Agnes Kellstrom's loom room for a long time without going in. Let me tell you about what was in that room, because this is the reason the story matters. The room was not large, maybe 12 feet by 15. The loom took up most of it, a 4-shaft counterbalance loom with a fly shuttle, the kind of loom that required real knowledge to build and real knowledge to use, and that had been made, as Noreen could see from the joinery and the specific way the beater was hung, by someone who knew exactly what they were making. Not a factory loom. A made loom. The wood was cherry, darkened to the color of old brick, and the joints were wedged mortise and tenon, in a style that Noreen had seen in examples from the Cornish-influenced workshops of the 1880s and 1890s, and almost nowhere else. She stepped into the room and did not touch the loom yet. Along the back wall were the shelves, 12 of them, floor to ceiling, organized with a precision that told her immediately that Agnes Kellstrom had been a particular kind of weaver, not a hobbyist, Not even a serious amateur, a record keeper, a documentarian of her own practice. Each shelf was labeled in a handwriting that was small and consistent, and had not changed much in 60 years. The labels read by year and by project type. The folders on the shelves were weaving drafts. Noreen understood what she was looking at before she pulled the first folder. A weaving draft is the written record of how a textile is constructed. It records the threading of each warp thread through the heddles, the tie-up of the treadles, the sequence of the treadling. A complete draft is a complete set of instructions for reproducing a cloth. In the hands of someone who knows how to read it, a draft is also something else. It is the specific intellectual property of the weaver who made it. It encodes their choices, their solutions, their innovations. It is the closest thing the textile world has to a composer's score. Agnes Kellstrom had been keeping drafts since 1933. There were 87 folders on those shelves. Noreen pulled the first one and opened it and looked at what was inside and felt something shift in her understanding of what she was standing in the middle of. The draft was for a double-weave pickup pattern in the Cornish overshot tradition, adapted for American cotton warp, with notations in Agnes's handwriting that explained every deviation she had made from the original structure and why. The notations were detailed. They were clear. They were the notations of someone who had understood the tradition deeply enough to modify it consciously, and had wanted whoever came after to understand the modification. Noreen pulled a folder from the 1940s. Same approach, same clarity, different structure. Agnes had spent the war years working with whatever fiber she could get and had developed a series of adaptations for mixed fiber warps that Noreen had never seen documented anywhere. She pulled a folder from 1971. By then, Agnes had moved into a territory that was harder to name. The drafts from this period were original structures, not adaptations, not borrowings from any tradition Noreen could place directly. They were solutions to problems Agnes had apparently set herself. Structural puzzles. The notations asked questions and then answered them across 40 years of subsequent folders. Noreen stood there for a long time. Then she went downstairs and found Ted Branscombe at his table with his coffee and his receipt book, and she said, "I'll take the Loom room." Ted looked up. "400 takes everything. That's the price." Noreen said, "I know, I'll take it." Ted wrote it down and took her check. Then Noreen went back upstairs, and she and Carrie spent the next 5 hours carefully boxing the folders and the fiber and the smaller tools, wrapping them in the cloth bags Noreen had brought, working methodically from the top shelf down. The loom they left for last, and they didn't try to move it that day. Noreen called her husband in Dodgeville, and he drove out with her neighbor's trailer after lunch, and the three of them disassembled the loom in the way that loom was designed to be disassembled, which was carefully, and in the right sequence, and Noreen noted that every joint was pinned in a way that made the disassembly intuitive. Whoever had built this loom had known someone would eventually need to move it. Ted Branscombe watched them load the last pieces from the doorway. He said, "That thing worth much?" Noreen said, "Parts of it." Ted said, "Huh." He went back inside. "Now let me pause here and ask you something. What did Ted Branscombe believe he had sold that Thursday morning? He believed he had moved a room full of old weaving equipment to someone who would probably use the loom and maybe look through the folders for patterns and donate the fiber to a guild somewhere. He had gotten $400, which was what he'd priced it at, which meant the sale had gone exactly as expected. In his business, that was the definition of a good transaction. He was also not wrong, exactly. He had priced what he'd seen. He had seen weaving equipment and a lot of paper. He had not seen what was in the paper because he'd had no way to see it. What was in the paper was approximately 60 years of undocumented original contribution to a textile tradition that had almost no written record anywhere. What was in the paper was a private archive of structural innovations and historical adaptations that no museum held, that no scholar had catalogued, and that would have been landfilled or dispersed into boxes at a guild sale within a year if no one had recognized what it was. Noreen Aldcroft had recognized what it was. Let me tell you about what happened in the 3 months after the sale, because the folders are where the story actually becomes what it is. Noreen worked through the archive in her studio in Dodgeville, one folder at a time, beginning in 1933 and moving forward. She kept her own notes in a composition book in handwriting that was, people who knew both women would later observe, not entirely unlike Agnes's. She cross-referenced Agnes's drafts against her own reference library, against the historical samples in her flat files, against photographs she had taken over the years at other estates and in other collections. What she found was this: Agnes Kellstrom had developed, between approximately 1938 and 1943, a technique for managing color shift in double-weave structures that solved a problem Noreen had seen referenced in the literature but never seen solved in surviving cloth. Agnes had not known, probably, that the problem was referenced in the literature. She had encountered the problem in her own work and had solved it herself, documented the solution thoroughly, and then continued weaving for 50 more years without telling anyone. Agnes had also developed, between 1955 and 1962, a series of adaptations of Cornish overshot patterns for 4-shaft looms that preserved the visual character of the original 8-shaft structures. This was a technical achievement. It was the kind of thing that textile historians wrote papers about when they found evidence of it in historical cloth. Agnes had left the evidence and the explanation in a folder labeled simply 1955 to 1962, overshot adaptations, filed alphabetically between 1953 and 1963, on a shelf in a room that had been priced at $400. Noreen called her contact at the Milwaukee Art Museum after she had been through about a third of the archive. She had worked with this curator, a woman named Dr. Haas, on several identification projects over the years. She described what she had. She did not describe everything. She described enough. Dr. Haas drove up from Milwaukee on a Friday and spent 8 hours in Noreen's studio. She went through 37 folders before she stopped and looked at Noreen across the table. She said, "Where did you find this?" Noreen said, "Farm sale outside Mineral Point." The woman had been weaving in the same room for 60 years. Dr. Haas said, "Does anyone else know about this archive?" Noreen said, "The man who ran the sale priced the room at $400. Dr. Haas looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked back at the folder in her hands. "Let me pause here and ask you something, because this is the moment the story turns on. Was Noreen wrong? She had paid the asking price. She had not misrepresented herself or her intentions. She had walked into a room, understood what she was seeing, and paid what the seller had asked. The estate sale system works on the principle that the seller prices what they have and the buyer decides whether to pay it. Noreen had held up her end completely. The question the story actually asks is different. The question is what it means that the same room full of folders could be invisible to one person and immediately legible to another, and what that gap represents, and whether the gap is anyone's fault, and whether fault is even the right word for it. Noreen's answer, which she gave once to her graduate student Carrie on a Sunday afternoon about 6 months after the sale, was this. She said the work was going to disappear. Agnes Kellstrom had spent 60 years making something that nobody around her had the vocabulary to see. That's not Ted Branscom's fault. He priced what he could price. The problem isn't him. The problem is that there was nobody between Agnes and the sale who could have said, "This is what this is," Carrie said, "until you." Noreen was quiet for a moment. Then she said, until me. But I came after. Ted Branscombe found out about the archive the following summer at a farm auction in Iowa County where he and Noreen happened to be. Someone who knew them both introduced the subject. Ted heard enough to understand the general shape of what he'd priced at $400. His face changed several times. Then he looked at Noreen and said, "You knew what you were buying when you walked in." Noreen said, "I had a pretty good idea." Ted said, "You should have said something." Noreen looked at him. "You priced it," she said. "That's your job. I paid the price. That's mine." Ted didn't have an answer. He walked over to look at some equipment, and Noreen watched him go and then went back to what she'd come to see. Now let me tell you about what happened to the loom. Noreen reassembled it in her studio in the space where she had previously kept her second warping board. She threaded it using one of Agnes's drafts, a double weave structure from 1947 that Noreen had identified as the clearest example of the color shift technique in the archive. She wanted to understand the technique in the way she always tried to understand things, which was through her hands. You could read a draft and understand it intellectually. You could also weave it and understand it in a different way that had no name but that every serious weaver knew. She wove 12 inches of cloth on Agnes Kellstrom's loom before she understood what she was holding. The cloth that came off that loom in a technique Agnes had solved alone in a farmhouse in Wisconsin had a quality that Noreen had seen in historical samples from the best workshops of the 1880s and had assumed required technology or materials that no longer existed. Agnes had produced it on a cherry loom in a 12-by-15 room with a fly shuttle and a lot of patience and the willingness to sit with a problem until she understood it. Noreen sat with that cloth in her hands for a while. Then she went inside and ate dinner and didn't talk about it that night. Let me tell you about what happened 4 years later, in 1998, because that is where the story becomes something larger than one woman and one room. By 1998, Carrie had completed her dissertation and taken a position at a small textile museum in Michigan. She had written one chapter of her dissertation about the Kellstrom Archive, the first formal scholarly treatment of Agnes's work, and the chapter had attracted the kind of attention in textile history circles that suggested the rest of the dissertation would be read. She called Noreen on a Tuesday morning and said, "I've been thinking about something." Noreen said, "Tell me." There are other rooms like that one. Other women who wove for 60 years in the same room and nobody knew what they had. The records are sitting in boxes right now, in attics, in estate sale lots, in recycling bins. Noreen said, "I know." Carrie said, "The people who could recognize what the records are getting old." There was a pause. Noreen said, "What are you thinking?" Carrie said, "I'm thinking someone needs to write it down. A guide. Something a person could use in the field. Not an academic text. Something practical." Noreen was quiet for a moment. She was sitting at her work table in Dodgeville with her coffee, and she thought about Agnes Kellstrom, whom she had never met, and about what it meant that a woman could spend 61 years solving problems in a room above a Wisconsin farm and leave the solutions on a shelf and die with a daughter in Phoenix who was an accountant and had never learned to weave and had no way to know that what was on the shelves was anything other than old paper. She thought about her mother's idea that a textile was a record. She thought about what it meant to keep a record that nobody around you had the vocabulary to read. She said, "We'd need photographs, good ones, and we'd need access to comparison samples." Carrie said, "I have the museum. You have your flat files." Noreen said, "And Agnes's archive." Carrie said, "And Agnes's archive." They started that fall. It took them 3 years, and it was not a book in any conventional sense. It was a field guide, photocopied on a department copier and spiral-bound at an office supply store, distributed through the weaving guilds and the Textile Museum Network and the estate sale professional associations in Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota, and Iowa. It had no publisher and no ISBN. Its title, written on the cover in Noreen's handwriting, was a field guide to historical textile records for estate and farm sale professionals. It ran to 168 pages. It included photographs of draft styles by region and period, descriptions of what different organizational systems told you about the weaver who'd used them, a section on fiber identification by sight and touch, a section on loom types and what their construction told you, about their age and origin, and a section Noreen had written herself on the specific textile traditions of the Upper Midwest and how to recognize documentation from those traditions. Ted Branscombe received a copy. He sent a note back that said simply, "I wish I'd had this in March of 1994. The guide is still in use. Carrie has updated it twice. The current edition runs to 240 pages and includes a section on digital archives and a protocol for photographing draft collections before dispersal." On the cover of the third edition, below the title, Carrie added a line. It reads, "For Agnes Kellstrom, who kept 60 years of answers in a room above a Wisconsin farm, and for the woman who walked through the door. Agnes Kellstrom's loom is still in Noreen's studio in Dodgeville. She uses it. The 1947 double-weave cloth is framed on the wall above the loom, not as a trophy, as a reminder of the specific character of the problem Agnes solved and the specific quality of attention Agnes brought to solving it, which is something Noreen can see in the cloth every time she looks at it, and which is not something she could explain to you in words, only in thread. Carrie's daughter is 14 years old. She spent last summer in Noreen's studio learning to read drafts the way Noreen's mother had taught Noreen and the way Agnes had taught herself. She has not decided yet whether she wants to pursue it seriously. That question is open. What is not open is that she can now walk into a room full of old paper and old equipment and understand that it might be something. She knows enough to stop and look. That is where most important things begin. Not with expertise, not with certainty, but with the decision to stop in a doorway and look before you walk past. Agnes Kellstrom stopped every morning for 61 years and looked at the problems in front of her and wrote down what she found. She did not expect anyone to read it. She wrote it down anyway, because that was what the work required. Someone eventually came through the door.